In the winter of 1847, the bells of St. Aurelia's chapel rang out across the valley in a sound both familiar and comforting to the townspeople who lived beneath its shadow. To them, it was the sound of mourning, of worship, of the promise of mercy. Yet, for those who listened more carefully, there were other sounds carried faintly on the cold air. Duller, metallic echoes that did not belong to bells. They came not from the tower above, but from beneath the chapel floor, the drag of iron, the strike of chain against stone, the hollow thud of footsteps on earth where no prayers were said aloud. The people of this rural province had little but their faith. Fields were poor, winters long, and disease visited more often than good harvests. The chapel, standing tall on a rise above the town, was both sanctuary and sentinel. It dispensed alms, bread, and baptisms, and its priests spoke with voices of solemn authority. Few ever questioned their deeds, for in this place the church was not just a house of God, but the sole arbiter of morality, of order, of hope itself. It was mercy, embodied in stone. At least, that was what the people wanted to believe. But as the century drew into its middle decades, darker whispers threaded themselves through the town's narrow lanes. The chapel's mercy, some claimed, was conditional. For every child it clothed, another seemed to vanish into its walls. For every sermon that promised salvation, there were murmurs of penances too severe to be spoken aloud. Those who dared to speculate lowered their voices as they did so. For to question the chapel was to question God himself, and few souls had the courage for such rebellion. Yet the contrast between what was seen and what was felt, the radiant bells above and the iron murmurs below, began to erode the townspeople's certainty. It was the ledger that bound these two realities together, though few would ever know it until decades later. A book kept by candlelight on a simple wooden desk, its pages thick with dust and ink. On the surface, it was no different from any other parish record. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, donations. But hidden among the names of the faithful were marks, tiny crosses, strange notations, entries without burials. Each bell that tolled above the town had a twin note inscribed in ink, and together they told a story far more dreadful than the chapel's sermons dared confess. To stand in the square on that cold morning was to feel both comfort and unease. Mothers crossed themselves at the bells, while children clutched crusts of bread the clergy had given them. Yet an old man at the fountain muttered that the sound had changed, that the bells carried not blessing, but burden. He remembered too many faces gone, too many nights when lights burned in the chapel's cellar windows. Sanctuary above, silence below. It was the duality that defined St. Aurelia's, and it is from this duality that the story must be told. The cold open of this tale is therefore not one of horror shouted, but of horror implied, of a town lulled by the promise of mercy, even as it stood atop chains. The year was 1847, and already the ledger's ink was thick with secrets. What remained was for those secrets to be found, for the pages to be read aloud, and for the bell's true purpose to be heard in their echo. For behind the piety of St. Aurelia's there lay a cellar, and in that cellar there lay the truth that would haunt the valley for generations. Before this account goes any further, it is necessary to pause and acknowledge the way it will be told. What follows is not a tale woven freely from imagination, nor is it a simple recitation of verifiable court records. It is, instead, a reconstruction, drawn from fragments of parish documents, later testimonies, rumors preserved in letters, and inventories kept in state archives. Where the facts are clear, they will be presented with precision. Where only whispers or disputed artifacts survive, that uncertainty will be made explicit. This approach is not to weaken the story, but to protect those who suffered within it from being reduced to spectacle. The material is grim. It involves harm inflicted under the cover of sanctuary, the betrayal of trust, and the quiet disposal of the most vulnerable. For those listening or reading, a content warning must be offered. Disappearances, confinement, and implied violence against innocents will surface repeatedly in the narrative. There will be no indulgence in graphic description or sensational detail. The horror lies not in gore, but in the contrast between the chapel's promise of mercy and the shadow of cruelty it concealed. If this is difficult to hear, the choice to step away is a respectable one. History often leaves us with wounds we must approach carefully. Ethics also demand transparency. Some of what follows has been dramatized. Dialogue reconstructed, moments expanded, atmospheres drawn in to convey what contemporary witnesses suggested, rather than what a stenographer might have written. In this, the intention is not deception but immersion, an attempt to restore voice and presence to those whose stories were nearly erased. Viewers and readers are urged to hold this in mind as they encounter artifacts and testimonies. A ledger is real, a letter draft is preserved, but the sigh of a survivor recalling the sound of bells This has been shaped for clarity, and yet even within this careful reconstruction, the tension remains between the sacred and the profane, between mercy as an idea and mercy as it was practiced. The chapel held itself as a beacon of compassion, offering bread to the hungry, shelter to the poor. But beneath the polished sermons and ringing bells lay a reality that demanded secrecy. To confront this duality is to step into a story that unsettles faith itself, a story in which the very institution, meant to protect its flock, may have preyed upon them. Before proceeding deeper into that darkness, one last invitation is given. As you listen, consider sharing where you are listening from. Are you hearing these bells from a city apartment, a rural town, or perhaps late at night with headphones pressed close? The comments, the conversations, become part of this record too, echoing across time much like the bells themselves once echoed across the valley. It is through such shared reflection that the past is not only remembered, but examined, its lessons held up against the light of the present. With these cautions and clarifications made, we can now return to St. Aurelia's chapel and the lives bound to it by faith, fear, and the ink of a ledger that recorded more than anyone in the valley dared to admit. The town that leaned on St. Aurelia's chapel was small enough that everyone knew one another by sight, yet large enough that its needs outweighed its means. Narrow lanes pressed between timbered houses, their beams sagging with age, while the market square stood as the only place where voices could rise above whispers. Surrounding it all were fields worn thin by years of poor soil and overwork, producing just enough to survive but rarely enough to prosper. Winters were harsh, often sealing the valley in snow, and outbreaks of illness arrived with cruel regularity. In such conditions, survival depended not only on hard labor, but also on the guidance and charity of the church. The chapel tower rose above all this, visible from every corner of the valley. Its bells marked the rhythm of life: baptisms, weddings, funerals, and feast days. For the townspeople, it was more than architecture. It was a symbol of protection, a place where heaven seemed closer than the mountains that hemmed them in. Yet this same prominence meant the chapel also commanded fear. When a priest spoke, his words carried the weight of divine judgment. A blessing could mean bread for a family. Disfavor could mean exile to the margins of the town, or worse, suspicion of sin. Thus mercy and menace walked hand in hand, inseparable in the minds of those who depended on St. Aurelia's. It was said that the clergy were tireless in their devotion. They offered alms to the beggars at the chapel gates, and during harsh winters, they opened their kitchens to serve broth. Mothers spoke of the priests visiting the sick, laying hands upon fevered brows. To outward appearances, the chapel embodied compassion, but in the same breath, neighbors whispered of young ones who had gone to the chapel for help and never returned. These were not the poor who left town seeking work elsewhere. These were children, orphans, and even the occasional stranger who came seeking shelter. The contradiction between public benevolence and private disappearance left an unspoken dread hanging over the cobblestones. The geography of the valley compounded this tension. With only one road in and out, bordered by steep hills and forests, the town was effectively enclosed. Travelers passed through infrequently, and most information came only by word of mouth or from the pulpit itself. This isolation bred dependence. If the chapel declared someone had sinned, there was no higher authority to appeal to, not without great cost and distance. Faith and obedience were the price of belonging, and most paid it willingly. Others, quietly, began to notice patterns too dangerous to name aloud. At the center of this world was the ledger, though few outside the clergy knew of its existence in detail. Officially, every parish kept such a book, recording baptisms, marriages, burials, and donations. It was the proof of life and death, the measure of community itself. Yet at St. Aurelia's, the ledger bore a heavier silence. It was locked away when not in use, brought out only by the senior cleric, and no layperson was ever permitted to see its pages. When townsfolk spoke of the ledger at all, they did so with reverence, imagining it as a holy archive. None guessed that within it, alongside the most ordinary of records, lay symbols and annotations that did not belong to the rituals of mercy. The moral stakes of this hidden history began to take root during these years. On one hand, the people believed in the sacred promise of the church, to forgive, to shelter, to save. On the other hand, they could not fully silence the unease that flickered at the edges of their lives. Every toll of the bell that announced a baptism also carried the unspoken question: who might vanish next? Every act of kindness from the priests carried its shadow of suspicion. The town existed in a state of double vision, forced to live within the contradiction of sanctuary above and secrecy below. It was in this world, isolated, devout, burdened by hardship, that the stage was set for the first incident, the first undeniable disappearance that would later stand out against the fabric of rumor. The people of the valley were not yet ready to name the truth. But the signs were already present, carried in the silence of the ledger and in the faint metallic echoes beneath the sound of the bells. The first true rupture in the valley's quiet faith came not with the disappearance of an adult or a stranger, but with the vanishing of a child, a boy whom nearly every villager knew by name. He was called Matthias, though most referred to him simply as the orphan, for his parents had been carried off by fever in the spring of 1846, barely 10 years old, thin as the reeds by the river. He survived for a time by doing small chores, fetching water, carrying baskets, sweeping hearths. His presence in the streets was so constant that people began to treat him as a fixture, pitied but familiar. And so, when the chapel announced that Matthias would be taken in under their care, there was a ripple of relief throughout the town. At last, they said, mercy had found him. For weeks, Matthias was seen within the chapel grounds. He rang the handbell at the start of service, ran errands for the priests, and was even heard humming hymns as he walked with a loaf of bread under his arm. Some villagers envied his fortune. An orphan lifted from the cold streets into warmth and safety. Mothers told their children to pray that they might earn the chapel's favor, just as Matthias had. The boy's smile, though shy, seemed to confirm that he had found his place. To the eye of the town, it was a perfect story. Need answered by charity, loneliness answered by sanctuary. But by the time winter thickened, Matthias was gone. At first, there was no announcement, no explanation. The boy simply ceased to be seen. When asked, one priest remarked casually that Matthias had been sent to relatives in another parish, though no one could name the relatives or the parish in question. Days became weeks and no letter arrived. The streets felt oddly hollow without the boy darting between tasks. Mothers asked quietly but received only vague replies. It was not until a month later, during a baptismal service, that some in the congregation noticed a chilling omission. The priest recited names from the ledger, marking the sacrament. But when the book lay open on the lectern, a parishioner caught sight of Matthias's entry. His baptismal name was there, but unlike the others, no burial date followed, nor any mark of relocation. Instead, beside his name, a curious symbol had been drawn, a cross, but not of the familiar Christian form. It was sharper, slanted, resembling a brand more than a blessing. This discovery circulated quietly among the townsfolk, though none dared speak of it publicly. To question the ledger was to question the authority of the chapel itself. Still, unease grew. How could a child vanish so completely? Without relatives arriving, without letters sent, without so much as a farewell? The comfort of the chapel's charity began to fray, revealing something colder beneath. Mercy had been promised, but where was Matthias? In the absence of answers, rumors multiplied. Some said he had been unruly and was sent away in disgrace. Others whispered that he had fallen ill and been buried without ceremony. A few, bolder in their suspicions, muttered that the chapel had claimed him for penance, a word that carried weight but no clear definition. The bells still rang, but their sound had changed in the minds of many. What once marked community now hinted at concealment. Innocence had entered the chapel's doors, yet silence emerged in its place. The vanishing of Matthias would later be remembered as the first true incident, the moment when suspicion crystallized into fear. For though children had been missed before, none had been so publicly embraced, then so thoroughly erased. The ledger's mark was small, just ink on parchment, but to those who noticed it, the symbol was louder than the bells themselves. It was the first sign that the chapel's records held not only the rites of mercy, but also the shadow of something else, a hidden accounting, written beneath the language of salvation. The discovery of the ledger entry marked the shift from whispered rumor to something resembling evidence, though at the time it was understood only by fragments, glimpses caught in passing. The parish ledger itself was never a book freely opened for the townsfolk. It was kept under lock and key, bound in thick leather with iron clasps, and placed upon the desk of the presiding cleric during baptisms and burials. Only the priests were permitted to touch it. Yet on that cold Sunday morning, with candles flickering against the stone walls, a villager seated near the lectern caught sight of the page as it lay exposed. The name of Matthias was written in the same flowing script as the others, but beside it was the mark, the slanted cross. Drawn with unusual force, the ink darker than the surrounding text. This villager, a miller by trade, later recalled how the sight chilled him. At first he thought it a mistake, a flourish of the quill, but as he studied it, he realized it resembled none of the other annotations he had glimpsed over the years. The other names bore symbols too, but ordinary ones. A simple cross for baptism, a circled mark for marriage, an abbreviated Latin phrase for burial. Matthias's entry stood apart. It had the look of a warning, not a blessing. The miller mentioned it quietly to his wife, who hushed him, warning that to question the ledger was to question the will of God. Still, the image lingered in his mind like a brand. The ledger, after all, was more than a record. It was regarded as the soul of the parish itself, the place where every life in the valley was inscribed and remembered. Families took pride in pointing to the pages where their lineage stretched, back through generations. It was a book of belonging, a proof that one's existence was woven into the sacred fabric of the community. To find a mark that carried no clear meaning was unsettling. To see it beside the name of a missing child was something worse. It suggested that the chapel knew more than it revealed, and that Matthias's fate was not an accident but an entry, deliberately recorded. Years later, when fragments of the ledger were finally examined by outsiders, scholars would note how strange these symbols were. Some resembled tally marks, others looked like coded shorthand. The ink varied in tone, suggesting different hands, different years. But in 1847, the townsfolk had no such analysis. Only the gnawing dissonance between what they were told, that Matthias had been sent away, and what the ledger suggested, that Matthias had been marked, his life reduced to a symbol whose meaning only the priests understood. This first artifact would become the cornerstone of later suspicions, but at the time it was a burden carried silently. The miller dared not speak openly, nor did the mother who later swore she saw a similar mark beside another child's name. They feared punishment, exile, or even the subtle condemnation of neighbors. Instead, the truth spread in fragments. In the tavern, someone muttering about strange ink. At the well, a woman whispering about symbols that didn't belong in God's book. The ledger had begun to betray itself, its margins hinting at a second story written beneath the surface. The contrast was sharp and painful. A book meant to record mercy now appeared to record something else entirely. Each stroke of the quill, once thought holy, could just as easily be a sentence of erasure. For those who caught a glimpse of Matthias's entry, the ledger ceased to be an archive of salvation, and became instead a silent witness to something unspoken, something hidden in the cellar beneath the chapel. It was proof, but proof no one dared admit aloud. Not yet. The bells still rang above, bright and clear, but the ink below was darker, and its meaning was only beginning to surface. Nearly a decade had passed since Matthias disappeared into the silence of the chapel's walls. The memory of the boy had thinned, absorbed into the fabric of whispered warnings mothers gave to their children. Behave, or you will be sent to the priests. But the unease never fully dissolved. By the mid-1850s, life in the valley seemed to have regained its rhythm. Harvests had been tolerable, the plague years were fading into memory, and the chapel continued to dominate both the skyline and the townspeople's conscience. It was during this uneasy calm that the second disappearance struck, and it struck not at the margins of society, but at its very heart. Her name was Clara Weiss, the daughter of a cooper and the betrothed of a merchant's son. She was 18, lively, and well regarded in the town, known for her singing, voice in the chapel choir, and for the way she carried herself with a dignity beyond her years. Her marriage had been arranged for the Feast of Pentecost, and preparations had filled the square with anticipation. Barrels of ale rolled into cellars, dresses stitched, gifts exchanged. For once, the valley seemed to be preparing for celebration rather than mourning. Clara's union promised not only joy but also the strengthening of ties between two respected families. On the night before her wedding, she was seen walking home from the chapel after evening prayers. She carried a small prayer book and a sprig of rosemary in her hand, both tokens of purity. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. By dawn, the bridal chamber was empty, her dress neatly folded on the chair, her shoes placed at the foot of the bed. The bed itself had not been slept in. The town awoke expecting bells of matrimony, but instead heard only the bells of morning service. The bride was gone. The reaction was immediate and electric. This was no orphan child whose absence could be brushed aside. This was a young woman whose future was woven into the hopes of families and neighbors alike. The household erupted in panic. The groom's family stormed the chapel, demanding answers. The clergy, calm and unflinching, offered a chilling explanation. Clara had succumbed to doubt on the eve of her vows and fled to a convent in another district. They spoke of it as though it were an act of devotion, a renunciation of earthly bonds in favor of God. But no letter came, no carriage was seen leaving, and no convent ever confirmed her arrival. Whispers ignited across the town. Some repeated the chapel's claim and interpreted it as a warning that even the most pious could be seized by religious fervor strong enough to forsake earthly love. Others, more suspicious, muttered that she had been taken by the very priests she had sung beside in the choir. Neighbors remembered how often she had been summoned to rehearse in the evenings, how the priests had praised her voice. The timing was too neat, the explanation too thin. Tension between faith and suspicion began to fracture the community. On the one hand, the chapel was still the source of charity, the hand that blessed crops, healed the sick, and provided alms. To accuse it of wrongdoing was unthinkable to many. On the other hand, the absence of Clara was undeniable, and the eerie repetition of what had happened to Matthias stirred memories long suppressed. To some, this was no longer coincidence but pattern. Mercy had once again cloaked something else, something predatory, hidden and cruel. The bells rang on the morning she was meant to be wed, their sound carrying across the valley like any other day. But the contrast was unbearable. Instead of joy, there was absence. Instead of a feast, silence. Where a bride should have walked arm in arm with her groom, there was only a ledger entry, written weeks later, that marked her name with another cryptic symbol. This time, more villagers claimed to see it, though none dared confront the priests. Clara's disappearance deepened the fracture in the town's spirit. For those who still believed in the chapel's sanctity, it was a test of faith, a divine mystery not to be questioned. For others, it was confirmation that the institution they trusted most was consuming the very people it was meant to protect. The contrast could not have been sharper. Love's promise extinguished by the tolling of bells. Sanctuary eclipsed by suspicion. The story of Matthias had been a whisper. The story of Clara was a wound, raw and undeniable. And yet the ledger went on recording, and the cellar below the chapel remained undisturbed, its secrets waiting in the dark. The scandal of Clara's disappearance could not be contained within the valley. Her family's status and the outrage of her betrothed's kin forced the matter beyond whispers at the well and grumbles in taverns. For the first time in living memory, outside authority was called upon to investigate the affairs of St. Aurelia's chapel. The figure who arrived was Prefect Johann Rademacher, a regional official dispatched from the district seat 2 days' ride away. His duty was clear, to determine whether a crime had been committed or whether, as the clergy insisted, Clara had departed of her own volition. Rademacher was no stranger to disputes between towns and parishes. In his ledger of duties, most complaints were about land boundaries, unpaid tithes, or disputes over inheritance. But what he encountered in the valley unsettled him. From the moment he entered the town square, he felt the air thick with distrust. The people looked to him with hope. Yet when the chapel doors opened and the priests came to greet him, he noted the townsfolk averted their eyes, as though fearful of being seen in opposition to their shepherds. The contrast was immediate and sharp. The community longed for intervention, yet remained bound in silence by their reverence for the clergy. Rademacher requested to see parish records. It was a simple request, customary in such inquiries, and yet the reaction was telling. The senior cleric, Father Anselm, hesitated before producing the ledger. When he finally did, he opened it himself, turning the pages with deliberate care, showing only those entries he deemed relevant. The prefect, trained to observe small details, noticed that certain sections were passed over quickly, as though to obscure them. He also noted that Clara's entry carried no notation of burial, marriage, or convent transfer, only her name, with another of those unfamiliar symbols scratched beside it. When Rademacher pressed for clarity, Father Anselm explained that the mark denoted private vows made in secrecy, a tradition of ancient piety, unworthy of public gossip. He spoke with such authority that several townsfolk nodded, though their eyes betrayed confusion. The prefect made note of the explanation, but unease gnawed at him. In his years of service, he had examined many ledgers, and never once had he encountered such symbols. He requested further documentation, letters to the supposed convent, witnesses to Clara's departure. The priests offered none. As part of his inquiry, Rademacher interviewed villagers quietly, away from the chapel's shadow. Some spoke cautiously of hearing bells late at night, of seeing lights flicker beneath the chapel floor. Others, braver still, whispered of Matthias and the cross marked by his name years before. A pattern began to emerge, faint but undeniable, a thread running from one disappearance to the next. Yet when the prefect compiled his notes and prepared to escalate his concerns to higher authorities, he encountered resistance. His superiors, influenced by the church's power, warned him against stirring scandal. To accuse priests of wrongdoing was to risk not only his post, but also the stability of the region. Here lay the heart of the contrast. Civic duty against clerical immunity, law against faith, suspicion against obedience. Rademacher's position was precarious. If he pressed too hard, he could be silenced or dismissed. If he yielded, he would betray the very people who had looked to him for justice. He chose a middle path, writing a cautious draft letter that detailed his unease. A letter he never dared to send. In the official record, the inquiry concluded inconclusively, noting only that no evidence of abduction or foul play could be established. The townspeople heard this pronouncement with weary resignation. To some, it proved the chapel's innocence. To others, it confirmed what they feared most, that even those who came from beyond the valley would be powerless against St. Aurelia's. The bells continued to toll. The ledger continued to turn, and the cellar beneath remained unentered. Yet the prefect's private doubts would not be lost forever. His unsent letter, hidden among his personal papers, would later resurface, a fragment of truth preserved in the margins of silence. For now, however, the valley learned a bitter lesson, that the institutions meant to protect them could be as complicit in their suffering as the silence of the priests themselves. Years later, long after Prefect Rademacher's name had faded from the valley's memory, his belongings were catalogued as part of the bureaucratic housekeeping that followed his death. Among the neat bundles of correspondence and official reports, archivists uncovered a single folded sheet, yellowed and brittle, its ink darkened with age. It was addressed not to a superior or a colleague, but to no one at all. The letter had never been sent. Its draft lines, hesitant and crossed through in places, bore the unmistakable hand of Rademacher. In this fragile document lay a private record of unease. He described cautiously what he had witnessed at St. Aurelia's, the missing bride, the evasions of the priests, the curious symbols in the parish ledger. He noted the silence of the townspeople, their reluctance to speak openly, and the way their eyes betrayed fear whenever the chapel was mentioned. It is as though, he wrote, the very walls of that house command them, binding their tongues tighter than any oath. Most chilling of all was the single sentence underlined in his hand. I believe there are subterranean cells beneath the chapel, though I could not gain entry to confirm it. The letter had been tucked into his papers as though meant for revision, perhaps intended for a superior he feared would ignore or punish his suspicions. Its survival seemed accidental, yet it provided the only surviving words of an outsider who had dared to name what others merely whispered. The phrasing was careful, almost apologetic, but its implications were clear. If cells did exist beneath St. Aurelia's, then the disappearances could no longer be explained away as private vows or youthful flights of devotion. They would be evidence of confinement, of deliberate concealment sanctioned by holy men. The contrast between what Rademacher allowed into his official report and what he admitted in this private draft was stark. Publicly, he had written of insufficient evidence, a phrase that protected his position while soothing the church. Privately, he confessed a growing certainty that he had glimpsed only the surface of something much darker. It was the difference between obedience and conscience, between the record of bureaucracy and the testimony of a man who could not sleep easily after what he had seen. When this artifact was finally made known to later investigators, it was hailed as proof that suspicion had existed even then, decades before the chapel's cellar was openly confronted. Yet in 1856, it remained hidden, folded into a drawer, its truth silenced by fear of reprisal. The townspeople never knew of it, and the clergy, confident in their authority, continued their rituals undisturbed. The letter's existence reminds us of how fragile truth can be, preserved not in proclamations but in hesitant drafts, in words never spoken aloud. It was a voice caught between duty and dread, a man who recognized what he had seen but lacked the power or perhaps the courage to act upon it. For the valley, his silence meant the continuation of disappearances. For us, reading it generations later, it becomes an artifact of contrast, one man's hidden alarm set, against the public calm that allowed the chapel's bells to keep ringing as though nothing were amiss. And so the ledger went on filling, and the symbols beside the names grew in number. The cellar, if it existed, remained locked and unseen. But the prefect's letter, unmailed, nearly forgotten, would prove that even in that era, the shadows beneath St. Aurelia's had been glimpsed, if only briefly by eyes that dared to look. By the winter of 1862, the valley had endured much. Harvests were uneven, disease struck in waves, and the people continued to lean upon St. Aurelia's chapel for stability, even as doubts lingered beneath the surface. Two vanishings in recent memory, the boy, Matthias, and the bride Clara, had not been forgotten, though they were spoken of only in hushed tones, softened by the explanations offered from the pulpit. But when the third disappearance came, it shattered the uneasy equilibrium. This time, it was not an orphan or a woman soon to leave her family, but a child at the very heart of the chapel's life. The boy's name was Lucas, the son of a baker, no more than 12. Unlike Matthias, who had been pitied, or Clara, who had been admired, Lucas was beloved. He sang in the choir, his clear voice lifting, hymns that filled the vaulted ceiling with a sound that moved even the weary to tears. People said his voice was the closest thing to innocence they had ever heard. On winter mornings, when the congregation shivered in their pews, it was Lucas's song that made the cold bearable. His presence was woven into the fabric of worship, as familiar as the candles on the altar. One December evening, during the season of Advent, Lucas failed to return home after rehearsal. His mother waited at the door, lantern in hand, convinced he had tarried too long at a friend's house. But by midnight, when no neighbor had seen him, alarm spread. The baker, his father, went to the chapel himself, pounding on its heavy doors. The priests answered with practiced calm, insisting Lucas had left hours before. They suggested he had run away, perhaps to avoid the harsh discipline of choir practice. But no one in town believed such a tale. Lucas was dutiful, gentle, and utterly devoted to the chapel's music. To imagine him abandoning it was unthinkable. The morning after his disappearance, the chapel bells rang for service, their sound bright and unbroken. Yet the congregation sat in strained silence, their eyes fixed on the choir stalls where Lucas should have been. The hymns were sung without him, but his absence rang louder than the bells. Mothers wept openly and fathers clenched their jaws. For the first time, the community's grief turned openly into suspicion. It was not only the boy's vanishing that stirred unrest, but also the uncanny parallels. Again, there was no letter, no farewell. Again, the ledger recorded his baptism but not his burial. And again, beside his name, there was a mark, this one drawn like a half circle enclosing his initials. A mother in the congregation, seated close to the lectern, whispered that she had seen it with her own eyes. By the week's end, half the town had heard her claim. The contrast could no longer be ignored. Hymns of salvation above, and muffled silence below. Sanctuary that claimed to protect its children now appeared to consume them. The townspeople found themselves torn between terror and rage. To accuse the priests outright was still unthinkable. They held too much sway, their authority reinforced by both tradition and fear. Yet the pattern was undeniable. 3 vanishings, each marked in the ledger with strange symbols, each smoothed over with implausible explanations. In taverns and kitchens, voices grew sharper. Some argued Lucas had been stolen by outsiders, wanderers passing through the valley. Others murmured that the cellar beneath the chapel was not only real but inhabited, that the priests took the children below, for reasons none dared describe aloud. The words penance and sacrifice returned, whispered like curses. Parents began to watch their children more closely, forbidding them from lingering after evening services. The loss of Lucas struck a blow from which trust could not fully recover. Unlike Matthias, who had no family to defend him, or Clara, whose case had been cloaked in talk of convent vows, Lucas had parents, siblings, neighbors, and a voice that had once filled the chapel itself. His absence was felt everywhere. Each echo of the choir a reminder of what had been taken. The people looked upon the priests differently now, not as shepherds, guiding the flock, but as figures cloaked in secrecy, capable of explanations that rang hollow against their grief. This third disappearance transformed suspicion into something closer to certainty. The pattern had become too precise to dismiss. The ledger's ink was no longer merely strange. It was damning, and though the townsfolk had not yet dared to storm the chapel doors, their faith had fractured. Beneath the solemn tolling of the bells, there was now a chorus of doubt, a sound that would not be silenced. The cellar, still unseen, loomed larger than ever in their imaginations, a hollow space beneath their prayers where innocence had gone and never returned. The winter after Lucas vanished, a quiet tension settled over the valley, like the snow that refused to melt from the chapel roof. Outwardly, life continued. Bread was baked, cattle driven to pasture, marriages celebrated in the nave of St. Aurelia's. But beneath the surface, the people carried a new vigilance. Children were no longer permitted to wander freely. Doors were bolted earlier, and though the bells still rang, their sound had shifted in meaning. Once they had called to worship, now they reminded the villagers of what was missing, their tolling a metronome of absence. It was during this season of unease that a figure entered the record, whose presence altered the story's course. Father Anselm, newly arrived from the diocesan seminary in Cologne, came to the valley as an assistant to the aging priests. He was young, sharp-eyed, and notably unburdened by the weight of local loyalty. Where the older clergy spoke with the certainty of decades in office, Anselm listened more than he preached. His sermons were mild, even hesitant, but his questions, after Mass, revealed a man, attuned to the fractures beneath the surface of the community. He heard the murmurs, about Matthias, about Clara, and most recently about Lucas. At first, He tried to answer them with doctrine, suggesting that mystery was part of faith, yet the look in the mother's eyes unsettled him. It was not curiosity they carried, but grief. When he began to hear talk of strange symbols in the parish ledger, his unease deepened. Unlike most, he had access to that book. The ledger was housed in the sacristy, kept in a carved chest beneath layers of linen. Anselm asked permission from the senior priest to examine it under the pretext of updating baptismal records. The old man, weary and trusting, agreed. Alone in the dim light, Anselm opened the book and found, alongside neat entries of births, marriages, and deaths, the marks the villagers had described. They were not smudges or careless flourishes, but deliberate signs, half-circles, crosses, even a triangle enclosing initials. They bore no resemblance to liturgical notation. He traced one symbol with his finger. The ink long dried but darker than the surrounding script, as though the hand that wrote it had pressed harder, more intent. The discovery left him chilled. In his training, he had read of medieval penance codes, marks once used to signify sins too grave to write plainly. Yet these symbols did not correspond to any system he knew. Their placement beside the names of the vanished gave them a weight he could not ignore. The ledger, meant to preserve the life of the parish, now seemed to conceal another record altogether, a silent testimony to absence. That night, Anselm recorded his thoughts in a private notebook. His handwriting, still youthful, betrayed urgency. "The people are right," he wrote. "There is a pattern here. 3 names, 3 marks. What do they signify? Judgment, selection, or merely the sign of those who will not return?" He resolved to observe more closely, though he admitted his fear. "If I ask too much, they will turn on me. Yet if I remain silent, I too become complicit." In these notes, preserved only in fragments, we see the contrast of roles, a priest meant to shield the church, and a man willing to question it from within. His presence marked the beginning of a shift. For the first time, suspicion was not only whispered among villagers, but entered into the consciousness of the clergy itself. Anselm did not yet dare to confront his superiors, but he had begun to document what he saw, turning his private notebook into a counterledger, a record, not of baptisms and burials, but of vanishing and unease. This dual record, the official book of the parish and the clandestine notebook of the assistant priest, embodied the fracture at the heart of St. Aurelius. On one side, the solemn weight of tradition and authority, bound in leather and stored beneath linen. On the other, the fragile pages of a notebook, hidden in a young man's chamber, filled with questions that might never be answered. The townsfolk could not know it yet, but in Anselm they had found an unlikely ally. His eyes had turned toward the cellar and its secrets. Though he had not yet descended, the bells still rang and the rituals still continued. But for the first time, someone within the walls of the chapel had begun to see those rituals for what they were, a curtain drawn across something darker. And though his courage had not yet been tested, the seed of resistance had been planted in ink. By the spring of 1863, Father Anselm's unease had hardened into conviction. He no longer believed the symbols in the ledger to be harmless clerical quirks, nor the disappearances to be unfortunate coincidence. Yet conviction did not translate easily into action. Each morning he vested alongside his seniors, intoning prayers in unison, his voice mingling with theirs as though nothing were amiss. Each evening he shared bread at the rectory table, nodding politely as the older priest discussed repairs to the roof or the scarcity of beeswax for candles. But beneath this daily rhythm, Anselm carried a growing dread. He began to test the boundaries of his superior's patience. In quiet moments he asked questions, carefully phrased, about the parish's past. What had become of Matthias, the orphan boy? Did anyone know whether Clara had truly taken vows in the convent? Why had Lucas's body never been found? If he had simply wandered into the forest, as some claimed? The answers were vague and uniform. Some stories were best left in God's hands, some mysteries beyond human reason. When he pressed further, the senior priest narrowed his eyes and warned him against indulging idle suspicion. The young cleric also spoke discreetly with the townspeople. He visited Lucas's mother under the pretense of offering pastoral comfort. What she shared unsettled him further. She had heard, in the nights following her son's disappearance, muffled sounds beneath the chapel floorboards during Mass, knocking, faint and brief, that no one else seemed willing to acknowledge. When she mentioned it to others, they shushed her, urging her not to repeat such things aloud. "If the priests hear me say it," she whispered to Anselm, "they will say I am possessed." This testimony gnawed at him. He returned to the chapel late one evening when the nave was empty, crouched near the choir stalls where Lucas once sang, and pressed his ear to the cold flagstones. At first there was nothing, only the hum of silence. Then faintly he detected what sounded like a draft, air moving through a space where there should be none. It was enough to convince him that a cavity existed beneath the floor. Whether it was a cellar or a crypt, he could not tell, but the sound left him shaken. In his private notebook he wrote, "There is no doubt, something lies beneath. The ledger is not symbolic only, it is a register. Those marked are those taken. But for what purpose, God alone knows. I feel the weight of conspiracy, and yet I am bound by vows that silence me. Which oath is greater, the oath to my superiors or the oath to truth itself?" It was at this juncture that Anselm made his most daring move. He began to sketch what he remembered of the ledger's marks, copying them into his notebook in order to compare and search for a pattern. He also recorded the testimonies he gathered, labeling them with initials rather than names to protect his informants. These pages became, in effect, the first investigative dossier on St. Aurelius, compiled not by an official of the state, but by a man within the church itself. But secrecy could not last forever. One evening, as he sat at his small desk copying another symbol by candlelight, the door to his chamber opened without a knock. The senior priest entered, his face half in shadow, and laid a hand upon the notebook. "Some knowledge," he murmured, "is not meant to be carried by one so young." His voice was gentle, but the pressure of his fingers on the book was unmistakable. For a moment, Anselm believed his work would be seized then and there. Yet after a long pause, the elder released it, offered a faint smile, and departed. The message was clear. His suspicions were no longer secret. He had been seen, perhaps even tolerated, but closely watched. To continue would be to invite consequence. And yet, in that moment of fear, Anselm also understood that his observations had meaning. If the priests wished to silence him, it meant he was close to truth. The contrast between their calm, fatherly exterior and the iron grip on his notes revealed more than words ever could. By the time he closed his notebook that night, his decision was made. He could not abandon the investigation, no matter the personal risk. The cellar beneath the chapel was no longer only a rumor whispered by widows and frightened children. It was a place he was determined to see with his own eyes. And so, with trembling hand, he wrote a final line before snuffing the candle. "The bells will not protect them forever." Summer arrived, and with it the feast of St. Aurelia, the chapel's most celebrated holy day. Pilgrims from surrounding villages filled the nave. Candles burned in great profusion, and the bells were rung from dawn until nightfall. To the casual observer, the valley seemed united in devotion, its faith unshaken. Yet beneath the pageantry ran a current of unease. Mothers clutched their children more tightly than before. Fathers lingered near the chapel doors instead of joining in the processions. The feast, meant to symbolize protection, had become a mask stretched over mounting fear. It was in the days after this festival that Father Anselm resolved to act. The warning from his senior still echoed in his mind, but it had not deterred him. It had hardened his resolve. He believed the cellar must be entered, and if the priests refused, he would find a way himself. Yet he also knew he could not do so without allies. His private notes alone, however damning, were fragile proof. He needed witnesses, people outside the clerical order, who could testify, should anything happen to him. He began quietly. First, he approached the baker, Lucas's father. Their conversation took place in the pre-dawn hours, in the still warm glow of the oven where bread was rising. The man was wary, his grief curdled into mistrust, but when Anselm swore he sought the truth, the baker's eyes softened. "If you descend there," he whispered, "take something of Lucas with you. He sang in that place. His voice will guide you." He pressed a small hymnal into the priest's hand, the boy's childish scrawl of initials still visible inside the cover. Next, Anselm confided in Marta, an elderly widow who had served as sacristan for decades. She had seen the parish through plague, famine, and war, and her loyalty to the church was ironclad. Yet when Anselm spoke of the sounds beneath the floorboards, her expression shifted. "You think you are the first to hear them?" she asked quietly. She told him of a night 30 years earlier when, alone in the nave, she had heard weeping that seemed to come from beneath the altar itself. She had reported it, but the priest told her it was imagination brought on by grief. Since then, she had remained silent. Her story became another piece of the hidden puzzle, one Anselm recorded in his notebook that very night. The final step was the most dangerous, seeking access to the cellar itself. The chapel's doors to the undercroft were rarely opened, reserved for the storage of relics and, officially, nothing more. Anselm waited until the senior priests had retired one evening after Vespers. Carrying only a taper and the hymnal tucked into his sleeve, he descended into the sacristy. Behind the carved chest that held the official ledger, he found a door of thick oak set flush with the wall. Its iron handle was cold, its hinges stiff with disuse. Yet the lock, to his astonishment, was unlatched. The descent was narrow and steep, the air cooler with each step. His taper threw unsteady light across stone walls slick with moisture. At the bottom, he entered a chamber scarcely larger than a peasant's cottage. Barrels and crates lined one wall, but his eyes were drawn immediately to the center. A row of low wooden doors, each scarcely tall enough for a man to crawl through. The air carried a faint odor of mildew and something sharper, metallic, that turned his stomach. He knelt, pressing his ear to the first of these doors. At first he heard only silence. But then, faint, so faint, came a sound like breathing, ragged and shallow. His hand trembled as he reached for the latch. But before he could open it, footsteps echoed above, heavy and deliberate. Someone was descending. He doused his taper and withdrew into the shadows. By the faint light of a lantern, one of the senior priests entered. His face was impassive, his movements practiced. He unlocked the second of the low doors and slid a bowl of bread inside, followed by a jug of water. A hand, pale and thin, darted out from the darkness within to seize them before the door was latched again. The priest turned and climbed the steps, his lantern glow shrinking until the cellar returned to darkness. Anselm's heart pounded, but his mind was clear. The cellar was no mere storehouse. It was a place of confinement. Lucas, Matthias, Clara, perhaps others had been taken here, locked away where the bells could not reach. He gripped the boy's hymnal so tightly the edges cut into his palm. When he returned to his chamber that night, he wrote in his notebook with feverish certainty. It is true. The cellar exists, and within it, living souls remain. The ledger is their death sentence, written in symbols that the world cannot read. I am no longer only a witness. I am a keeper of proof. The contrast between the feast above, candles, hymns, pilgrims praising Saint Aurelia, and the silence below had never been sharper. Sanctuary had revealed itself as prison, and mercy as captivity. And though Anselm was still only one man, his resolve was no longer tentative. He had seen with his own eyes what the ledger concealed. From that moment forward, his life was bound to those hidden voices, whether he could free them or not. The days after his secret descent weighed on Father Anselm like a stone pressing upon his chest. He walked among his parishioners, blessing children, hearing confessions, distributing bread. But every gesture felt hollow, a pantomime performed above the knowledge he now carried. The cellar was not an idea, not a rumor. It was real, and it held the living. Each time he saw Lucas's mother, her face drawn and pale, he could not keep himself from hearing again the rasping breath he had detected behind those wooden doors. He knew he could not return to the Undercroft alone, not without risking discovery. Yet silence was intolerable. His notebook swelled with entries, drawings of the narrow doors, sketches of the symbols beside each vanished name, transcriptions of Marta's account and Lucas's mother's whispered testimony. Still, he recognized that these writings would mean little if he were silenced. He needed to share what he had seen. The question was, with whom? One evening, under the cover of darkness, he made the decision to bring the baker into his confidence. The man had already entrusted him with Lucas's hymnal, and grief had sharpened his willingness to believe what others dismissed. In the warmth of the bakery's back room, with the smell of yeast thick in the air, Anselm unfolded his notebook and, with shaking hands, revealed the sketches. The baker stared for a long time before speaking, his voice low. "You tell me my boy is still alive down there?" His words quivered between hope and horror. Anselm, unwilling to promise what he could not prove, replied carefully, "I heard breathing. I saw a hand. I cannot name whose, but the cellar is not empty." The man wept quietly, then pressed his flour-dusted palm over the priest's ink-stained hand. "Then it must be opened. But if we act too soon, they will kill him, or all of them." His words crystallized Anselm's fear. Action was necessary, but timing was everything. To rush would mean disaster. To wait would mean complicity. Their secret alliance formed that night, a fragile pact between a grieving father and a priest torn by conscience. Over the following weeks, Anselm continued his pastoral duties outwardly unchanged, but his private hours were spent in planning. He considered writing to authorities beyond the diocese, perhaps to the prefecture in Cologne. Yet the memory of Prefect Rademacher's unsent letter haunted him. Officials could be silenced, papers buried. A confrontation within the valley itself might be the only hope. In his notebook he began a new section, labeled simply Strategy. Here, he listed names of townsfolk he believed could be trusted. Marta the sacristan, whose loyalty was tempered by age and sorrow. The blacksmith, a man of formidable presence who had once lost a niece in unexplained circumstances. The midwife, who knew too many stories of infants spirited away under cover of pious explanation. For each, he noted whether they could be approached directly or whether caution demanded intermediaries. Still, he wrestled with dread. Each morning as he vested for Mass, He wondered if the senior priests had already guessed how far he had gone. The older man's hand pressing firmly on his notebook weeks earlier had been a warning, not a dismissal. He feared eyes followed him even as he walked through town, that whispers carried ahead of him into the rectory. At night, in the narrow bed of his chamber, he dreamt of the cellar doors that would not open no matter how he pulled, doors behind which voices cried out but could not be freed. His anxiety manifested in subtle ways. Parishioners noticed his gauntness, his distracted expression, and whispered that the young priest was too earnest for his own good. Some said it was a virtue, others a liability. But to the baker, to Marta, and to those he had cautiously drawn into his circle, it was clear that his earnestness concealed a dangerous determination. The most haunting entry in his notebook from this period reads, "I have begun to count the bells differently. Where others hear calls to prayer, I hear warnings. Each peal measures the hours of captivity below. Each silence between tolls is another breath stolen from them. The bells no longer sanctify, they accuse." Thus, suspicion within the valley, once diffuse and fragile, began to coalesce around a hidden core of resistance. It was still only whispers, still only sketches and grief and trust exchanged in secret. But for the first time, the balance began to tilt. The priests who presided above the cellar were no longer unchallenged, guardians of mercy. Beneath their calm liturgy, a counter-movement was stirring, quiet but resolute, prepared to bear witness. The contrast grew sharper by the day. Sermons of salvation in the nave, and beneath them, a gathering storm of dissent, fragile, fearful but inevitable. And in the pages of a young priest's notebook, the story of St. Aurelius shifted from whispered rumor to recorded indictment. By the autumn of 1863, the valley had reached a breaking point. Too many names lingered without graves. Too many explanations rang false. People still attended Mass, still knelt at the altar, but the trust that once bound congregation to clergy had frayed to threads. The disappearance of Lucas remained a wound that would not heal. And every Sunday, the empty stall in the choir seemed to reproach the priests more loudly than any parishioner dared. Against this background, Father Anselm's clandestine efforts began to sharpen into open defiance. His alliance with the baker had already given his suspicions weight, but now he widened the circle. Late at night, under the glow of lanterns shielded with cloth, he gathered a handful of trusted townsfolk in the bakery's back room. Among them were Marta, the aging sacristan, the blacksmith, broad-shouldered and blunt-spoken, and the midwife, whose quiet authority was born from years of ushering life into the world. To this small assembly, Anselm laid out what he had seen in the cellar, the narrow doors, the hand that seized bread, the breathing in the dark. His voice trembled as he spoke, not from uncertainty, but from the enormity of what he risked in telling them. For a long while after, there was only silence. Then the blacksmith struck his fist against the table, rattling cups. "We cannot let them keep our children like cattle." The midwife shook her head, cautioning restraint. If they moved rashly, the priests could deny everything, and the captives would vanish deeper still. Marta, her hands folded in her lap, murmured that she had served the chapel too long to see it turned into a prison. "If St. Aurelia herself could walk among us," she said softly, "she would strike these stones down." Anselm recorded their words faithfully in his notebook, alongside a new heading, Testimonies of the Living. In this section, he compiled not only their recollections, but their willingness to act. For the first time, his notes read less like an observer's journal and more like a manifesto. He wrote, "The ledger is no longer theirs alone. We are now a counter-ledger, a record of truth kept against their lies, yet secrecy proved difficult to maintain." Rumors began to circulate. In taverns and workshops that a new priest was stirring trouble, questioning the order of things. Some said he sought to bring the bishop down upon the valley. Others whispered that he was bewitched by grief and could not tell visions from fact. These whispers carried inevitably back to the rectory. The senior priests greeted Anselm with the same mild civility as always, but their silence grew heavier, their eyes sharper. He began to feel watched even in the sacristy, as though every movement of his hand toward the ledger was measured. It was during this tense season that an artifact emerged, an old inventory slip from the diocesan archives, discovered by the midwife's cousin while assisting a traveling scribe. The slip listed provisions delivered to St. Aurelius 3 decades earlier: bread, candles, sacramental wine, and, curiously, chains 20 in number, for the holding of penitents, though chains could have been intended for symbolic, ritual, or for restraining those deemed possessed. The implication was damning when laid beside Anselm's discoveries. The midwife delivered the slip to him, and he tucked it between the pages of his notebook, as though placing a fragment of iron into a reliquary. Proof was gathering. Still, action loomed unresolved. Some urged an open confrontation, a demand that the cellar be unsealed before the congregation. Others counseled waiting, fearing that evidence must be irrefutable before challenging such entrenched authority. Anselm found himself suspended between these poles, his nights consumed by prayer that felt less like devotion and more like bargaining. His words to God grew stark. If silence condemns me, let my speech condemn me more. Only do not let their bells keep ringing while the children starve below. The contrast was intolerable now. Outward piety gilded with incense and Latin chant, and beneath it the gnawing certainty of chains. Bowls of bread and breath stolen in darkness. The chapel proclaimed mercy, but its mercy had become captivity. The priests preached salvation, yet beneath their feet the saved cried out unseen. Thus the valley stood at a threshold. On the surface, a community faithful and obedient. Beneath, a circle of resistance, small but determined, gathering testimonies and artifacts in secret. The ledger was no longer only the priest's record of absence. It had become the fulcrum of a mounting conflict, one that could no longer remain in whispers much longer. The question was no longer whether the cellar existed, but how long it could remain locked before the valley itself demanded it be opened. By the winter of 1864, the tension that had been gathering for years finally threatened to snap. The valley could no longer sustain its double life of ritual above and secrecy below without some decisive break. The congregants, long accustomed to swallowing their doubts, began to show signs of open resistance. Attendance at Mass, once unwavering, declined. The pews grew patchier on Sundays, the sound of hymns thinner, less certain. Families whispered that to send their children to the chapel was to court danger, and many kept them home under the pretense of illness. The very authority that had bound the community together was unraveling. Father Anselm felt this shift keenly. It was as if the silence that had cloaked St. Aurelia's for decades was finally cracking, letting the murmurs of truth seep through. His notebook now bulged with accounts, not just from his closest confidants but from others, emboldened by the growing atmosphere of distrust. A farmer spoke of hearing chains rattle when he passed by the chapel at night. A maid confessed she had been ordered never to open certain doors while cleaning, and once, ignoring the instruction, had glimpsed iron fixtures in the stone that looked like restraints. Anselm transcribed every word, each testimony another nail in the coffin of secrecy. Yet he also knew time was against him. The captives in the cellar, whoever they were, could not endure indefinitely. Bread and water sustained them, but the air below was damp and thin, and their cries grew weaker with each passing month. The baker pressed him relentlessly. If my Lucas is still alive, every day you hesitate is another day he suffers. But Anselm feared that rash action would not only doom the captives but unleash violent reprisal upon the townsfolk. He paced his chamber at night, torn between urgency and caution, between saving lives and preserving proof. The turning point came with the discovery of another artifact. One evening, while reviewing the official parish ledger in the sacristy, Anselm noticed a loose scrap tucked between the pages. It was not bound with the rest but inserted deliberately, perhaps as a placeholder, or perhaps as something meant to be hidden in plain sight. On it were columns of numbers, dates matched with quantities of bread, wine, and water, but the figures did not align with public records of the congregation's needs. There were too many rations listed, far more than the visible parish could consume. At the bottom of the page was a crude symbol, a triangle enclosing 3 initials. Anselm recognized them immediately. They were the first letters of Matthias, Clara, and Lucas. He carried the slip to the baker that very night. The man studied it with trembling hands, his knuckles white. "They feed them," he whispered, "but they do not free them. This is worse than I feared." Marta, when shown the page, crossed herself and muttered that the priests were keeping their own congregation underground, as if running 2 churches, one in the open, one in the dark. The midwife spoke even more sharply. "This is not penance. This is possession, by power, by control. They have turned God's house into a cage." It was decided then that a confrontation could no longer be avoided. Plans began to form, to gather the townsfolk in numbers too large for the priests to silence, to demand that the cellar be opened in their presence, and to bring the ledger and ration slip as evidence. The blacksmith vowed to bring his hammer, not as a weapon but as a tool, should doors need to be broken. The baker swore he would not leave the chapel until he had looked into the cellar with his own eyes. Anselm, though terrified, agreed to lead them. In his notebook he wrote, "The hour is near. We have lived too long in shadows. If we fail, their bells will ring louder than ever. But if we succeed, the bells may finally fall silent, or ring in truth for the first time." The contrast could not have been more stark. Above, a chapel preparing for Advent, polishing candelabra, rehearsing hymns, readying sermons of hope. Below, the slow starvation of voices confined in darkness. And around it all, a village bracing itself for rupture, where faith no longer protected but demanded reckoning. What awaited was no longer speculation. The cellar had to be opened, the ledger laid bare, the silence broken. Whether it would bring salvation or destruction, none could know. But the balance had tipped. The valley was moving from suspicion to confrontation, from whispered dissent to public demand. The chapel's secret life was about to collide with the world above it, and nothing, neither the priests' authority nor the tolling of the bells, could prevent the clash that was coming. The confrontation began on a bitter January morning, when frost clung to the chapel's eaves and smoke curled from the chimneys of the village below. The people gathered not at the hour of Mass but earlier, in silence, carrying lanterns against the dim light and tools in their hands. Hammers, axes, even farm implements disguised as walking sticks. It was not a mob, but neither was it a congregation. It was something caught between devotion and rebellion. The bells that usually summoned them to prayer rang instead, to warn the priests that the valley itself was approaching their door. At the head of this company walked Father Anselm, his cassock dusted with snow, the parish ledger and ration slip bound in twine beneath his arm. His face was pale but set. He had spent the night in prayer, though no comfort had come from his words. It felt less like a vigil and more like a farewell, to safety, to obedience, perhaps even to life. Behind him trudged the baker, whose eyes were red-rimmed with sleeplessness, and the blacksmith, carrying his hammer openly. Marta clutched her rosary with trembling fingers, while the midwife walked upright, chin lifted, her presence a quiet rebuke to the men who claimed spiritual authority but kept their parishioners in chains. When they reached the doors of St. Aurelia's, the priests were already waiting. 3 of them stood on the steps, clad in vestments too fine for the season, as though trying to shield themselves in ceremony. Their leader, Father Otto, lifted his hand in greeting, though his expression was as cold as the frost around them. "Children," he said, "what is this gathering? The chapel is not yet open." The blacksmith stepped forward, his voice carrying in the clear air. "We have come to open what you keep closed. The cellar, the doors beneath." A murmur rippled through the crowd at the words, though none contradicted him. The priests exchanged glances, their composure strained but not broken. Father Otto answered smoothly, "There is no cellar but for storage of wine and vestments. You speak of shadows." It was then that Anselm brought forth the ledger and the ration slip. He raised them high, his voice steady though his hands shook. "Shadows do not eat bread. Shadows do not drink water. Shadows do not breathe beneath the stones. Here is the proof, written in your own hand." He opened the ledger, reading aloud the columns of provisions, the discrepancies, the initials scrawled at the bottom of the scrap. Each word hung in the air like a hammer's blow, undeniable, stark. The reaction was immediate. Cries of recognition and outrage broke from the crowd, parents who saw their children's initials, neighbors who recalled vanished kin. The priests tried to quiet them with gestures and benedictions, but the murmurs swelled into shouts. "Open the doors!" voices cried. "Show us!" "Where are they?" The priests retreated a step, and for the first time their confidence faltered. Father Otto raised his voice above the clamor, invoking the authority of the bishop and the sanctity of the church. But it was too late. The balance of power had shifted. The people no longer bowed their heads. They surged forward, forcing the priests to retreat into the chapel itself. Inside, the sacred space that had once been sanctuary felt suddenly like a battleground. Candles flickered, icons gazed down impassively, and the altar loomed like a stage where truth would be demanded. The blacksmith approached the side aisle where a locked door, seldom noticed, now stood as the focal point of every eye. He lifted his hammer. Father Otto rushed forward, placing himself between the door and the villagers. "This is sacrilege," he cried, his voice cracking. "To break this door is to break faith with God himself." But it was Marta, frail and gray-haired, who stepped forward then. She raised her rosary, not as a weapon but as testimony. "It is not God you keep behind these doors," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "It is his children." The crowd roared in assent, and with that, the blacksmith brought his hammer down. The wood splintered under the blow, echoing through the nave like a gunshot. The priests shouted, some even clutching at the villagers in desperation. But they were pushed aside. Blow after blow rained down until the lock gave way and the door swung inward. Exhaling a damp breath of stone and rot, a darkness deeper than night yawned before them. And from within came a faint sound, thin, ragged, human. It was not the sound of ghosts but of the living. The contrast could not have been starker. The golden light of candles above, The black mouth of the cellar below. The people stood at the threshold between them, trembling. Their faith in tatters, yet their resolve hardening. What they had demanded was no longer theory. It was there, behind the broken door, waiting. And as they prepared to descend, the question was no longer whether the ledger had spoken truth, but what terrible truth awaited them in the depths of St. Aurelia's. The air that rose from the cellar was not merely cold, but fetid, as though the stones themselves exhaled the dampness of years. The crowd pressed forward, their lanterns lifted, though few dared to step beyond the threshold. It was Father Anselm who descended first, his heart hammering. The ration slip clutched in his hand as though it might serve as both proof and shield. Each stair groaned beneath his weight, and with every step, the sound from below grew clearer. A hollow cough, a low moan, the scrape of something shifting against stone. These were not the noises of the dead. They were the unmistakable sounds of the living. The blacksmith followed close behind, lantern raised high, its flicker throwing warped shadows along the walls. Behind them came the baker, gripping a length of wood like a cudgel, though his eyes betrayed only terror and hope, not aggression. A few others trailed after, unwilling to let their priests confront the unknown alone, while the rest crowded at the mouth of the cellar, whispering prayers or curses under their breath. The passage curved downward into a vaulted chamber. Iron rings jutted from the walls, and lengths of rusted chain lay scattered on the floor. Bowls crusted with old bread and stains of water testified to their use. In the far recesses of the chamber, huddled shapes stirred. When the lantern light reached them, gasps and cries erupted from above. There were three at first, thin figures, hair matted, eyes wide and blinking against the sudden glow. Their clothes hung in tatters, their bodies marked by months, perhaps years, of confinement. The baker stumbled forward, his lantern nearly falling from his grasp. "Lucas," he breathed, his voice cracking. One of the figures lifted his head, and though his face was gaunt and nearly unrecognizable, the boy's eyes held the same green flecks the baker's wife once boasted of. The man dropped to his knees, reaching through the dimness to embrace his son, weeping openly. The boy could barely lift his arms, but he whispered, hoarse and broken, "Father." The sound reverberated through the chamber, shattering any last illusion that these were merely penitents under discipline. The other captives revealed themselves slowly, four more emerging. From niches in the wall, their limbs unsteady, their expressions half mad from darkness. Among them, Marta recognized a young woman who had vanished the year prior while walking to market. Another bore a scar the blacksmith recalled from his neighbor's son. Each recognition spread through the group like fire. These were no strangers, no outcasts sent from elsewhere. These were their own, lost kin, hidden in plain sight. From the top of the stairs came shouts of alarm. The priests had tried to force their way through the crowd, but the villagers blocked them. Father Otto's voice echoed down into the chamber. "Do not believe what you see. These are not children of God, but souls under penance, dangerous and unclean." "They consented to this!" His words rang hollow now, drowned out by the groans and sobs of those below. Anselm turned, his lantern casting his shadow tall across the wall. "No penance lasts years in chains. No discipline requires silence and starvation. You have imprisoned them not for their sins, but for your power." His voice trembled, yet it carried the weight of every testimony he had gathered, every prayer unanswered. The confrontation teetered on a knife's edge. Above, the priests clung to their authority, insisting on obedience, invoking the wrath of the bishop. Below, the villagers wept and clutched their returned kin, fury growing stronger than fear. The cellar itself seemed to embody the contrast. Faith turned to cruelty, mercy perverted into captivity. The blacksmith, voice rising with the authority of plain speech, declared, "We will not leave them here another night. If you call this God's will, then God himself is against you." He struck the chains with his hammer, the clang reverberating like a tolling bell. Links shattered, falling to the damp floor. The villagers cheered, and one by one, others stepped forward to free the captives. The priests shouted warnings of damnation, but their words found no purchase. Each broken chain was another fracture in their authority. Each freed captive another proof against their lies. As lanterns swung and iron fell away, the chamber filled with sobs, prayers, and defiance. In that moment, the valley crossed a threshold it could never return from. The cellar was no longer a rumor or suspicion. It was a wound torn open, its infection exposed to the light. The ledger had led them here, but now it was the cries of the living that bore witness louder than ink. The climb back up the stairs began, the captives supported by trembling arms, their first breath of open air in years drawing gasps and coughs alike. Above, the crowd parted to receive them, faces streaked with tears. The priests stood cornered, their vestments suddenly stripped of their power. The bells of St. Aurelia's loomed overhead, but for the first time, the villagers no longer looked to them for direction. They looked instead to one another and to the broken chains that clattered at their feet. The release of the captives did not end the struggle. It only shifted the battleground. As the weakened men and women were carried up into the nave and laid upon pews, the full congregation pressed inward, some weeping, some clutching the freed by their hands, all shaken to see with their own eyes what had been denied for so long. The cries of reunion filled the air, parents sobbing over children thought lost, siblings clasping one another in disbelief. These sounds, raw and unfiltered, rose higher than any hymn ever sung beneath those rafters. But amid the joy, another current coursed through the room, rage. The people turned as one toward the priests. Father Otto, robes disheveled, tried to raise his arms in benediction, but his voice quavered under the swell of anger. "You do not understand what you have done," he insisted. "These souls were dangerous. We preserved you from them. They were afflicted, unclean." His words faltered as Marta, frail yet resolute, stepped forward from the crowd. She raised her rosary like a weapon not of violence but of truth. "I see no demons here," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Only children of God who you caged like beasts." The villagers erupted, shouting over the priests. "Lies! Murderers! You starved them!" The blacksmith struck his hammer against the stone floor, and the sound silenced the room for an instant. "If they were so dangerous, why did you hide them instead of seeking help? Why did you not let us decide as their kin?" The question hung in the nave like smoke, unanswerable, damning. Anselm opened the ledger again and read, "Allowed entries of rations, delivered at odd intervals. The cold arithmetic of captivity." He then held up the scrap bearing the initials of the missing. "This is not penance. This is record-keeping for imprisonment, written in their own hand with no shame." He turned the page toward the villagers, letting them see the ink for themselves. No one could deny it now. The ledger, once a silent instrument of power, had become evidence of sin. The priest's composure cracked. One attempted to flee toward the sacristy, but was seized by the crowd. Another fell to his knees, pleading for mercy, insisting he had only followed orders, that the bishop in the distant city had sanctioned special penances for the wayward. The villagers spat at the words. If the bishop had sanctioned it, then corruption ran deeper than their valley. If not, then these men had betrayed both their flock and their God. Either way, no absolution could come from their lips. The contrast in that moment was starkest of all. Those who claimed divine authority stood trembling, exposed as jailers and deceivers, while the ordinary folk, farmers, artisans, mothers, children, rose in unity, their grief transformed into power. The symbols of sanctity, the altar, the vestments, the ringing bells, suddenly seemed hollow compared to the clatter of broken chains still echoing in the nave. The captives, still weak, bore witness themselves. Lucas, leaning against his father's chest, croaked out fragments of what he remembered. Being led down the stairs, told he must atone in silence, left in the dark with only scraps of bread. Another, the young woman Marta recognized, whispered that she had begged to be released, promising to confess to anything, but her pleas were met only with more darkness. These testimonies, ragged though they were, seared the crowd with fresh fury. The priests had not preserved them. They had silenced them, for reasons still unfathomable. It was the midwife who voiced what many were thinking. This was not about sin. This was about control, to terrify us with disappearances, to remind us that only they held the keys to life and death. Her words spread like fire. The priests shouted over her, denying, but no one listened. Their authority had collapsed in an instant, undone by the very evidence they once guarded. The villagers began to argue among themselves, not about guilt, which was plain, but about justice. Some cried for the priests to be cast into the cellar themselves, left to taste the darkness they had imposed. Others urged restraint, fearing reprisal from higher authorities, or damnation for raising hand against consecrated men. The chamber filled with clamor, with the chaos of a people discovering their chains had been of obedience as much as iron. Amid the noise, Anselm raised his voice, not loud, but steady enough to cut through. "We must not become them, but neither can we return to silence. These men must answer, not only to us, but to those who placed them here. Their sins must be carried beyond this valley, to the ears of those who think their hands are clean." He trembled as he spoke, knowing that this would not end with one confrontation, but with a reckoning that could ripple far beyond the chapel's walls. The priests, pale and cornered, huddled together like prey. The crowd advanced, their decision still forming, caught between vengeance and justice, between wrath and law. The captives watched, their hollow eyes reflecting lantern light, witnesses now not only to their own suffering, but to the struggle of a community deciding what it meant to seek truth, without losing itself to cruelty. In that suspended moment, the valley held its breath. The cellar had been opened, the ledger revealed, the captives freed. Yet the most dangerous question lingered unanswered. What to do with those who had built their power on chains and lies? The confrontation had reached its apex, but resolution was still out of reach, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The bells of St. Aurelia's loomed overhead, silent now, their next toll uncertain, whether it would mark vengeance, justice, or the beginning of something darker still. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and divided councils. The cellar stood open, its chains still scattered on the stone floor like discarded relics of a false faith. The freed captives lay in the care of neighbors, tended by the midwife and watched over by families who had once mourned them as lost. Word spread from farm to farm, over frozen fields and across mountain passes, until the valley buzzed with the revelation. The priests of St. Aurelia's had kept their own flock in darkness. But what to do with the men who had presided over such cruelty remained a question that gnawed at every household. By torchlight, gatherings were held in barns and kitchens. Some voices, sharp with grief, demanded swift retribution. "Let them taste the chains they forged," cried one father whose daughter had not been found alive. Others, trembling but cautious, urged that the matter be carried to the bishop in the city. "If we punish them here," a miller argued, "the church will call us heretics and send soldiers. Our children will pay the price." Between these poles, the valley swung, unable to settle, torn between the justice of the heart and the peril of the law. Father Anselm worked tirelessly, moving between households, recording testimonies by candlelight, urging restraint where tempers threatened to flare into violence. His notebook, now swollen with pages, became a second ledger, one not of chains and rations but of voices and memories, an archive of the truth the priests had sought to bury. He wrote with an almost fevered intensity, knowing that these accounts might be all that stood between his people and the accusations of rebellion when higher authorities inevitably learned what had occurred. The priests themselves were confined, not in the cellar but in the rectory, guarded by villagers in shifts. They were fed sparingly, yet treated without cruelty, for Anselm had pleaded that they be preserved for testimony. Still, their presence was a poison in the village. At night, their voices could be heard chanting psalms through the barred windows, their words mingling with the wind like mockeries of piety. Some villagers crossed themselves and turned away. Others hurled curses, unable to bear the sound. The contrast was stark. Men who had chained innocents now calling upon God for mercy, while their victims struggled to eat bread without flinching, to sleep without nightmares. Artifacts continued to emerge as if the chapel itself, once cracked open, could no longer hide its secrets. Marta discovered a bundle of coded notes tucked into the lining of a confessional, scribbled in Latin abbreviations that detailed transfers and substitutions. Anselm translated them as he could. Each note appeared to match a disappearance, with marginalia about suitability and completion. The language was cold, clinical, stripped of names but damning in implication. When he read these aloud at one gathering, even those who had counseled caution could not suppress their outrage. The ledger was not an accident of poor record-keeping. It was part of a system, planned, deliberate, ongoing. The bishop's name began to rise in every conversation. Was he complicit or deceived? Some argued that no bishop could remain ignorant of such practices for so long, that orders must have trickled down from the city. Others insisted the priests had acted alone, abusing their distance from oversight. The uncertainty deepened the villagers' unease, for it meant their battle might be against not 3 men, but an entire hierarchy cloaked in sanctity. The captives themselves added their voices, though weakly. Lucas, still gaunt but stronger with each passing day, recounted how he had been told he carried stains of sin, too great for ordinary confession, and must endure the discipline of silence until he was pure. Another captive remembered overhearing priests whisper about balancing the numbers, as though people were entries in a ledger to be shifted and erased. Their testimonies transformed grief into purpose. No villager could any longer pretend this was a misunderstanding. The debate turned at last to confrontation beyond the valley. "We must carry the ledger and the chains to the bishop himself," Anselm urged during one tense gathering. "If he denies us, then the world will see him for what he is. If he grants us justice, then the rot may yet be cut away." The blacksmith scoffed, saying no bishop would ever condemn his own. But the midwife countered, "If we do nothing, we become accomplices. If we wait for their justice, we wait forever." The decision was slow, painful, and far from unanimous, but a consensus emerged. A delegation would leave for the city, bearing the artifacts, the testimonies, and the freed captives themselves as witnesses. The valley would not take vengeance into its own hands, not yet, but would demand that justice be given. It was a gamble that could save them or destroy them, for if the bishop's court chose to protect its own, the valley might be branded as liars or worse, heretics. And so preparations began. The ledger was wrapped in linen and sealed with wax, as though it were scripture itself. The broken chains were bundled, heavy and rusted, to be laid at the feet of the bishop. Testimonies were copied and signed by trembling hands. The villagers whispered farewells to those chosen to travel. For the road to the city was long and the outcome uncertain. The contrast of the valley's life had never been so sharp. In one house, children laughed again at the return of a sibling. In another, families mourned those who had not emerged from the cellar alive. Joy and rage lived side by side, like two halves of the same breath. The bells of St. Aurelia's remained silent, their ropes cut, their voice stolen by the very people who had once depended on them. It was not the church that called the people to gather now, but the memory of chains clattering against stone and the promise that such chains would never again be forged in their valley. But as the delegation prepared to depart, an unease settled over Anselm. He wrote in his notebook, "We carry truth into a city built on silence. Will truth be welcomed or buried deeper?" The ledger weighs heavily in my hands, but heavier still is the knowledge that power does not surrender easily. We march not only against men, but against the habit of obedience itself. The valley had freed its children, but the greater reckoning lay ahead. The ledger had opened the cellar, but whether it could open the ears of those who ruled from gilded cathedrals remained to be seen. The village's decision had been made. The journey into the heart of power was about to begin. The journey to the city took more than a week, though in memory it would feel like a single, unbroken passage through shadow. The delegation moved in silence most days, leading wagons that carried the freed captives bundled in blankets, their hollow faces peering out at a world they had nearly forgotten. At night they huddled around meager fires, the ledger and its bundle of chains kept close, guarded as though they were relics of immeasurable worth. Each page of testimony, each fragment of proof, was all that stood between them and the accusation of heresy. Anselm, who bore the ledger most nights beneath his cloak, scarcely slept. He scribbled observations even on the road, recording the captives' dreams, their sudden starts at ordinary noises, their whispers of hunger and fear. His notebook was no longer just a record. It was becoming a weapon. The city loomed at last, its spires cutting the sky, its bells tolling with a grandeur that mocked the valley's silence. The bishop's palace was a fortress of carved stone, its gates wide but guarded, its halls lined with men in clerical garb whose expressions betrayed no surprise at the petitioner's arrival. To them, the delegation looked like peasants with accusations, no different from 100 other villages clamoring for aid or justice. Yet when the bundles were opened and the rusted chains clattered upon the marble floor, the air changed. Even hardened scribes faltered at the sound. Before the bishop, a tall man whose ring glittered with authority, Anselm laid out the ledger, the ration slips, the coded notes. He spoke not as an accuser but as a witness, steady and precise, reading aloud the entries of bread and water that matched the months of disappearance. The freed captives were brought forward one by one, their gauntness testifying more loudly than words. When Lucas, leaning on his father's arm, whispered what had been told to him, that he must endure silence until cleansed. Even the stoniest officials shifted uneasily. The bishop, however, betrayed little. His face was an unreadable mask as he listened, nodding occasionally, offering no judgment. When at last Anselm concluded, there was a silence in the chamber heavy as lead. Then the bishop spoke, his voice calm, measured, paternal. "What you have suffered is grave. What you bring before us is troubling, but we must tread carefully. Scandal destroys more souls than sin itself. We cannot permit a wound in one valley to fester into a wound upon the church entire." The words chilled the delegation. They understood then that the bishop's concern was not for truth but for survival of the institution, not the people. He promised an investigation,